Most people taking antidepressants believe that these medications are fixing an underlying problem in their brain. This is not true, and if you've been misled about this by your doctor or what you've heard from an expert on TV, you really deserve to know the truth. Because if you don't actually understand what these drugs are doing to you, there's a good chance they can make you worse. And so in today's video, we'll discuss where the chemical imbalance myth came from, what these drugs actually do, and the top 3 ways this lie is leading to worse mental health for millions of Americans. Now, for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Dr. Josef Wit Doeering. I'm a board-certified psychiatrist, former FDA medical officer, and I'm an expert in psychiatric medication side effects. Now, a few years ago, this very issue exploded into the news when a landmark paper reviewed all of the evidence linking depression to serotonin, and well, they found nothing. And what I'm going to do now is break this down for you, and really the best way to do this is by reviewing a news debate between the lead author on this paper and another academic who takes antidepressants. Let's check it out.
Now, a new study by University College London has discovered that there is little to suggest that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance.
So this is called into question what antidepressants do and how they work and administered. Now, one of the authors of the study, Dr. Joanna Moncrief, joins us in the studio alongside Dr. Ellie. Good to have you both.
Good morning, both of you. Now, Joanne, can you
Thank
tell
you.
us a little bit about your findings and what they actually mean?
Yeah, of course. So there's been this idea around for a long time that depression might be caused by a chemical imbalance, particularly by a serotonin abnormality. And serotonin is one of the chemicals in the brain that facilitates the communication between nerve cells, transmits a message from one cell to another.
I want to show you where this came from because this was never proven, but for whatever reason, the FDA actually allowed drug companies to air a whole bunch of ads in the 2000s saying exactly this. Let's check out one of these ads quickly.
You know when you feel the weight of sadness. You may feel exhausted, hopeless, and anxious. Whatever you do, you feel lonely and don't enjoy the things you once loved. Things just don't feel like they used to. These are some symptoms of depression, a serious medical condition affecting over 20 million Americans. While the cause is unknown, depression may be related to an imbalance of natural chemicals between nerve cells in the brain. Prescription Zoloft works to correct this imbalance. You just shouldn't have to feel this way anymore. Only your doctor can diagnose depression. Zoloft is not for everyone. People taking MAOIs or Pimozide shouldn't take Zoloft. Side effects may include dry mouth, insomnia, sexual side effects, diarrhea, nausea, and sleepiness. Zoloft is not habit-forming. Talk to your doctor about Zoloft, the #1 prescribed brand of its kind. Zoloft. When you know more about what's wrong, you can help make it right.
Now that is crazy. Do you see the framing around this? It's not, hey, depression is complicated. It can be caused by relationship problems, a lack of meaning and purpose. It can be caused by physical health issues or even trauma that you've gone through. No, it is a serious medical condition believed to be caused by an imbalance in the brain that drugs like SSRIs or Zoloft can fix. There was hundreds of millions of dollars behind these marketing campaigns. And most Americans saw this and they said, FDA would never allow this on TV if it wasn't true. And so many people now believe that depression is due to this chemical imbalance. So that's where it came from. Let's go back to the interview.
But it's been suspected for a while that maybe the evidence on serotonin and depression wasn't that strong, but no one had really taken an overview of all the research. So what we did was to get together all the different research on serotonin and depression in the different main areas that it's been looked at in. And when we put it all together, we came to the conclusion that really there wasn't any evidence that depression was linked with a serotonin abnormality. Certainly there was no evidence that depression is associated with low serotonin levels.
Now, I've read this article, so I want to tell you a little bit about what they did. I mean, this was a systematic review where she looked at all of the evidence. And so they looked at autopsies where, they were able to get slices of a brain to look at, and they looked at receptors, and they had depressed people and non-depressed people. They looked at their brains, no difference in the receptors. They looked at laboratory studies where they stuck needles into the cerebral spinal fluid of depressed people and non-depressed people and measured the metabolites of serotonin. There was no difference. So this is the kind of stuff that she was looking at.
And just briefly explain serotonin, how it works and what it does to us.
So serotonin is one of the chemicals in the brain that helps messages transfer from one nerve cell to another.
Right, okay. So if your study sort of suggests that depression might not be always down to low serotonin levels, are there any other reasons other than people's lifestyles and how they are in the world that would suggest that, you know, is depression just down to people's
Life experiences,
or is there any genetics there?
So there's been lots and lots of research on the biology of depression, but serotonin, the links between serotonin and depression are one of the most thoroughly researched,
Right.
and there's been masses of research on that over decades and decades now. There is evidence that depression is strongly linked with what happens in people's lives, with adverse life events, both in childhood and later in life. So my conclusion is that we're left with that evidence that suggests that depression is a response to life events, but not with any convincing evidence that there is a specific biological element to the causation of depression. Of course, there are things that go on in our brains when we feel depressed. It's not to say there's nothing happening, but we haven't been able to so far pin down any biological factor that's linked with depression.
And what she's talking about is one clear thing, whether it's low dopamine, low serotonin, low BDNF, or any of these other, low glutamate, or any of these other, catchphrases. We're always looking for there's this one thing broken in the brain. We never find it. There's never anything convincing there. What is true, though, is that there's personality differences. And there are some people out there who are worrywarts and they're nervous Nellies, but that's not really due to a single problem in the brain. These are very complex, what we call polygenic traits. It's a whole multitude of different genes that people have, and they may tilt someone towards being more moody or more anxious or nervous. But that's not really a medical problem or a brain problem. That's just normal variations in people's personalities.
It's really interesting. I mean, it's actually blowing up my mind, if I'm honest with you. So antidepressants, is it a placebo then? Would you suggest it's a placebo that we're feeling, that if we feel better when we take the antidepressants?
Yeah. So many people have been told that antidepressants work by rectifying a chemical imbalance, and it has been the belief of doctors as well that antidepressants are doing something to the biology of the brain, and that's how they work. But there are other ways that they might be having effect. So you're absolutely right in that regard, and we know that they have a substantial placebo effect. When you compare an antidepressant with a placebo, if you look at all the trials together, there are thousands of trials, most of them done by the pharmaceutical industry, most of them very short term.
Very short term. When I was at the FDA, I was shocked to see that there were no studies, there were no double-blind randomized controlled trials that went longer than a year. This is crazy for a drug that people take on average for 5 years. And so when the FDA says safe and effective, they should be saying safe and effective for the 1 year they were studied for.
Antidepressants are a little bit better than an inert placebo, but the placebo has a lot of effect, and it's also possible that the antidepressants have a bit of a sort of amplified placebo effect because people can recognize often that they're taking an antidepressant, and we know that if people think they're on an active drug, that improves their outcome.
So I want to go a little bit further than this. As a psychiatrist who's put thousands of people on antidepressants, I don't do that anymore. And I've personally taken Zoloft, and my wife has taken it as well. There's clearly a drug effect there. These are drugs just like alcohol or cannabis or amphetamine. They have a characteristic drug effect with antidepressants. It's generally one of emotional blunting and restriction, which can feel very therapeutic if you're highly anxious. Now, the problem with this is that this is just a drug effect. It's not fixing anything, so it's essentially masking symptoms. And the other issues with drugs is that they wear off over time, so it's not a very sustainable long-term solution.
Dr. Ellie, let's bring you in. Why are so many people prescribed antidepressants, and what's your take on this?
So it won't be a surprise to Joanna to know that I disagree with her, and I've been very open about the fact that I take antidepressants myself for anxiety. And I think that's important to mention, actually, that we use antidepressants actually for a lot of different conditions. So I take them for anxiety, somebody in my family takes them for an eating disorder, other people I know take them for depression. And they don't work for everybody. I'm always very, very sort of keen to say that. Look, I take paracetamol when I've got a headache, and it works. But I know that headaches aren't caused by a lack of paracetamol in my body.
Yeah.
And just like we have sort of the trials that Joanna's looked at that show that serotonin may not be linked to depression, we also have a lot of trials that look at, do antidepressants, whatever they do, Do they work to treat the symptoms of depression or OCD or anxiety? And just like we have the evidence that Joanna's looked at, we have evidence to show, yes, for some people, definitely not for everybody. And I say that to patients. And I could bring you in a whole lot of people who antidepressants don't work for. And I'm lucky that they work for me. But there are people for whom they do work very well, whatever they do to the serotonin.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with this is that most people have been told that antidepressants are specifically fixing something in their brain. They're not told, like, hey, this is like taking a paracetamol or an OxyContin that's just masking your pain. And really, we're not getting to the underlying problem. When they see their doctors are telling them that it's fixing this underlying problem. And that's very bad because it ends up distracting people from actually getting to the root cause of where the depression is coming from.
The trials that Dr. Ellie refers to, as I say, they show very marginal differences between antidepressants and placebo. And we can't identify a group that have a good response and a group that have a poor response.
That's true. It's a lot of trial and error when you get on these things.
So we're left with this average response, which really is very small. And as I say, may be accounted for by amplified placebo effects, but also it might be accounted for by some of the changes that antidepressants make, some of the mental changes that they produce. So we know that antidepressants can have a slight emotional blunting effect, for example. Some people report that, and that applies to not only unpleasant emotions like depression or anxiety, but also to positive emotions.
And that's true. A lot of people will come off these drugs because they would rather be able to feel the highs of life than feel nothing at all. They'll say, you know what, let me take some of that dark depression if it means that I can experience the joy of getting proposed to, or my wedding day, or the birth of my child. All of these things become blunted, and that can really take the zest out of life.
That, of course, might also explain why they look slightly different from a placebo. And that effect might be helpful to people, but I think people need to know or consider that might be one of the ways they're working, instead of being told that they correct a chemical imbalance, which we haven't.
I do worry though, because obviously there's like 8 million people on antidepressants, and someone might watch this and go, well, I'm going to stop taking them. I don't want to take them.
Yeah.
And you definitely can't do that, can you?
No, absolutely not. So it is important. It isn't really important to point out that this isn't sort of new data or a new study. It's merely a collection of cherry-picked papers to sort of look at sort of serotonin. People should not...
Sorry, Ellie, they weren't cherry-picked. This was a systematic review.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
people should not stop taking their antidepressants, absolutely not, because if you do need to stop taking antidepressants, we need to withdraw you.
So we'll stop it there. Obviously, you have to come off these medications slowly. And if they're treating the symptoms, you're going to need to find something to essentially replace that drug. Now, I want to go on and summarize. This was massive news when it came out, and many patients were really upset when they heard this because they had been believing for decades that the drugs were like fixing something in the brain. And when this spilled out into the news, it was incredibly embarrassing for the psychiatric establishment. And you can imagine why. Patients were furious with their doctors that there really wasn't any evidence for this chemical imbalance that they had been told about for years. And now this isn't the first time this issue has come up. It actually came up in the 2010s. And one of the lead editors of the biggest psychiatric trade journal that there is, the Psychiatric Times, was asked about this, was asked about why so many people are talking about depression being due to a chemical imbalance and whether psychiatrists actually believe this. And here's what he said at the time. In truth, the chemical imbalance notion was a kind of urban legend, never a theory seriously propounded by well-informed psychiatrists. Now, he might have thought that, but that's certainly not what the public thought, because surveys from around that time found that nearly 80% of people thought that depression was due to a chemical imbalance because of all of that garbage that was going out on the TV as ads. Now, this very famous editor of this big journal was pushed on this, saying, hey, well, that's not true because so many people believe this. And this is what he wrote in reply. He actually conceded, and what he said was horrible. He said, yes, some doctors believe that they will help patients feel less blameworthy by telling them you have a chemical imbalance. And it's easy to think you're doing the patient a favor by providing this kind of explanation, but often it isn't the case. He goes on to say, my impression is that most psychiatrists who use this expression feel uncomfortable and a little embarrassed when they do so. It's kind of a bumper sticker phrase that saves time, allows the physician to write out that prescription while feeling like the patient has been educated, kind of in air quotes. If you are thinking that's a little lazy on the doctor's part, you are right. But to be fair, remember, the doctor is often scrambling to see those 20 other depressed patients in her waiting room. I'm not offering this as an excuse, just an observation. Well, it does sound like an excuse because what it sounds like is what a lot of people feel already. They're essentially using this lie to pacify patients, to explain to them why they should take this drug so they can churn through them, so they can see them in these 15-minute visits and they can get to the line of patients in the waiting room. But that is incredibly unethical because doctors should not be lying to patients about how a drug works and what it does just because they want to move quickly on and see the next person. A lie is a lie. Hey, really quick message here. If what you're hearing is troubling you, do not suddenly stop taking these medications. That can be very dangerous. In fact, these drugs often need to be tapered over several months to sometimes years. And so if you're interested in learning how to safely come off a psychiatric medication with your doctor, I've created a free guide that shows you exactly how to do this safely and comfortably. Click the link below this video to get it emailed to you. So let's move on now. Now you might be wondering, if these drugs are not fixing a well-understood chemical imbalance, well, what are they doing? And this is really important because what they're doing is producing drug effects. Just like cannabis or alcohol can change your mood through their drug effects, antidepressants do the same thing. And each antidepressant produces a slightly different effect depending on its pharmacology. SSRIs primarily boost serotonin. SNRIs primarily increase serotonin and norepinephrine. Wellbutrin affects dopamine and norepinephrine. And mirtazapine affects histamine, alpha-adrenergic receptors, and also serotonin receptors. And the tricyclics, well, they just hit multiple neurotransmitter systems. These aren't drugs being used like antibiotics where they're fixing a well-understood problem, where each medicine is designed to correct a specific issue. These are drugs that are like every other drug that create altered mental and physical states through their effect on neurotransmitter systems. That's why doctors use SSRIs more for anxiety and OCD, because they're more emotionally blunting. That's why doctors use Wellbutrin for low energy and low motivation, because it's more stimulating. And that's why doctors use mirtazapine for insomnia and low body weight, because it's sedating and increases appetite. Now, why is all of this such a big deal? If you believe this drug is fixing a well-understood serotonin problem in your brain, you're naturally going to think this. All I need to do to fix my depression is take this drug. You start thinking that your depression is like type 1 diabetes, where you simply don't produce enough insulin and all you need to do is replace it, and that's that. In fact, doctors even tell this to patients. Whenever a patient is hesitant about taking an antidepressant, I always hear doctors say this: well, you wouldn't be hesitant if you were a diabetic and you needed to take insulin, so why is this any different? Well, here's why. Because in type 1 diabetes, that's an autoimmune disease where the insulin-producing cells are destroyed, and you actually can't make insulin. You have an insulin deficiency, which is easily measured on a lab test. And if you just replace that insulin, all of the downstream consequences of this disease largely disappear. And so, well, what is happening in depression? Well, first things first, people with depression do not consistently have low serotonin, dopamine, or any other neurotransmitter. That's why we don't do any neurotransmitter tests to diagnose depression. In many cases, these medications are actually creating abnormal chemical states in the brain. You know, SSRIs, they're boosting serotonin. SNRIs are doing serotonin and norepinephrine. And Wellbutrin, as I mentioned before, is boosting dopamine. These drugs are disturbing normal neurotransmitter functioning in the brain. And that's how they're creating their drug effects. And when you understand that what these drugs are doing is disrupting our neurotransmitter systems, everything else makes sense. You start to understand why people develop tolerance to these drugs. That's when the drugs wear off over time. Because what you see is that in many long-term users of antidepressants, over time, they require higher and higher doses. And eventually, after a couple of years, they're maxed out on the medication. And then they need to start another medication and then another medication. And they're constantly experiencing diminishing benefits over time. And this is how you get people who end up on 5 or 6 medications long term. So these drugs are not fixing any chemical imbalance in the brain. In fact, they're actually causing chemical imbalances in the brain. Now, this is what Joanna Moncrief actually found in her research. Check this out. She said this: one study in this review found that antidepressant use was associated with a reduction in plasma serotonin. And it is possible that the evidence for reductions in SERT density, that's serotonin receptors, and 5-HT1A receptors, those are serotonin receptors, in some of the included imaging studies reviews may reflect compensatory adaptations to serotonin lowering effects of prior antidepressant use. What it's saying is if you've been taking antidepressants for a long period of time, the body is pushing back against that and it's actually getting rid of these receptors so it can use homeostasis to stay in a balance. She goes on to say, the authors of one meta-analysis also highlighted evidence of serotonin levels being reduced after long-term antidepressant use. These findings suggest that the long-term antidepressants might produce compensatory changes that are the opposite of their acute effects. Lowered serotonin availability has also been demonstrated in animal studies following prolonged antidepressant administration. And so as you can see, long-term use of these medications is actually causing chemical imbalances, not fixing them. Now let's go on and talk why this lie has been so dangerous to the millions of Americans taking these drugs. Firstly, it makes people think that you just have to take the drug and everything is fine. And that's not the case. You're taking a drug that causes a drug effect that masks your symptoms, and you're becoming dependent on this drug at the same time. And because you're becoming dependent to this drug, you always have to worry about, when is this drug going to stop working? Will I need a higher dose? When will I need another drug added? And higher doses and additional drugs often come with more side effects. And over time, here's what I see in my practice. Many people become so burdened by medication side effects that the cure becomes worse than the disease itself. The second problem with this is it robs people of the awareness that these drugs are not a definitive solution. If you present them as a magic bullet that's fixing some kind of well-understood biological deficit, people stop looking for other ways to improve their mental health. They stop working on their physical health. They stop building coping skills. They neglect their relationships. And they stop pursuing greater meaning and purpose in their lives. And third, it blinds people to the possibility that the drugs themselves can actually be making them worse. If you always just think the drug is fixing something inside of you, and then when that drug wears off because you develop tolerance, just like people do whenever they take any other drug, you just start to assume that your depression has returned. Or if that drug starts to make you worse and starts causing fatigue or low motivation or brain fog, which is really common in chronic SSRI users, people won't suspect that the drug is actually making them worse. They'll just assume that they've developed a new or a worse psychiatric condition. So now that we understand the problems with these medications, is there a way that these drugs can be used safely? And there is. Here's how. The first thing that you need to know, you need to recognize that these are drugs. They're not targeting any underlying disease process. They're producing altered mental states that may reduce symptoms for some people for a limited period of time before you adapt to them. And so you need to be aware that these drugs are just masking a problem, and you don't want to ignore where your symptoms are coming from. Those symptoms of anxiety and depression, they could be signaling problems in your physical health, your lifestyle, relationships, or your environment. You need to listen to those signals and try and fix them instead of suppressing them with a medication. Secondly, these drugs are best used short-term, not as lifelong solutions. And if you do take them, your doctor should always talk to you about, hey, what's the plan to come off these medications? How long are you going to be on them for? Oh, it was due to a relationship problem. We're going to have you do interpersonal therapy in the meantime, and we're going to come off at month 6. Okay, so that's all for today, guys. Thank you so much for listening.